Welcome to another episode of the Feature Presentation Podcast, where every week we take a deep dive into the trenches of independent filmmaking. I'm your host, Derek Diamond, and for those who are watching the live version on YouTube, we're a little bit earlier than we normally broadcast, but that's perfectly okay, because joining me this week is filmmaker and fellow podcaster, Miss Louise Palanker. Louise, how are you?
I'm very well. How are you doing?
I'm doing fantastic, and I've been really excited to have this chat with you since we booked it because, every week on this show I talk with those who work in the film industry, whether it's directors, actors, writers, but it's not very often that I get to chat with those who also do a podcast and really kind of understand the nuances and really what it takes to make a podcast and do it well. And you've been doing it for so long, so I'm really excited to pick your brain about it. So I really appreciate you taking the time.
Oh, I'm happy to do it.
So why don't we get started with the film side of your occupation, because you do so much and you've done so much in the entertainment world. So what was it that made you want to get into show business?
I think I always wanted that as a child. I grew up in a part of the country that had no showbiz attachments whatsoever, so it was a tricky thing to want to say out loud. Of course, there were kids saying they wanted to be an actor or a singer, but we had no concept of what the other careers might be within the entertainment industry. And you could watch the credits roll by and see that there's people there doing stuff. So, I kind of was determined to grow up and get out to Los Angeles and sort of investigate. But I went and did the safe thing, and I got my teaching degree. And I love kids and I mentor kids, and so I keep my hand in the educational side of things as well.
Well, I think it's also good to still have that plan B. I know there are some actors that I've talked to that have said, don't make a plan B. I don't necessarily agree with that, because there's always the possibility that it doesn't work out. And you having that background in education, I think is really cool, because there's not enough people that want to educate and pass on knowledge to the next generation, and then that causes them to pass the knowledge on to the generation after that. So I don't think I hear enough people say that, so I think that's really cool.
Yeah, and I don't think you even have to call it a plan B. I would just say diversify. There should be many, or at least a few different things that you could go ahead and do to make a living. And nowadays it's not as if someone just goes to get a job at the company and works there until they get their gold watch. I mean, we all have various chapters in our lives, and we're presented with different opportunities, and we may do one thing and then do another thing on weekends, or we may pursue a passion that turns into a living. There's all sorts of different ways that your life may unfold, so I would just say to kids, diversify.
Absolutely. And it's good to have a little bit of variety in life too, because if you do the same thing over and over again, it gets you kind of lose your passion for it. At least that's been my experience.
Yeah, challenge yourself, and always be seeking what more you could be learning or what more you could be sharing with others.
So you mentioned going out to Los Angeles. How ultimately do you kind of get the process started of getting into where you are today?
For me, the pathway was getting a job as a studio page, and then supplementing that with internships, unpaid internships. And by that, I mean, you go anywhere, and, you can really start this in high school. You just kind of reach out to the people that inspire you, and you contact them and you say, hey, is there any way that I could intern with you? Because people are impressed with young people that show an interest in what they do. It's almost kind of flattering, right? If there's some kid that keeps contacting you and say, like, you are the exemplification of everything that fascinates me, and I would just love to get coffee, or possibly ask you a couple questions. But for me, so the pathway was internships, and this is before the internet, so you had to have a friend that was enrolled at UCLA who would go in and look at the job board, because I wasn't allowed in there. So you have to find kind of workarounds back then to get your way in. I had graduated college back east, so I didn't have any connections to UCLA's job board, other than my cousins went in there and wrote down some stuff that was interesting. Some of it was not the right fit. One of them I remember was like a agency that booked lookalikes. So like you could hire for some event someone who looked like someone else, and I was like, I don't want to work with people who look like people. I want to work with people. So I kind of like called them and said, yeah, I don't know if this is going to work out, because I didn't know what it was when I went in. You know, you interview for these internships. I wound up with an internship on a show called That's Incredible, and which is in the 80s. And then I wound up with an internship on a show called Our Magazine. And all this while I continued to look for a job as a page. Those are highly coveted jobs that usually go to nieces and nephews of higher ups. But I finally got a job as a page, and I was a page on a lot called Metro Tape. And the year that I was a page, we were doing all of the Norman Lear sitcoms, which included One Day at a Time, Different Strokes, The Jeffersons, Facts of Life. And then there was also a talk show that taped there called The John Davidson Show, which was an afternoon talk show John Davidson had inherited from Mike Douglas. And so I kind of got to meet all of the sort of big stars from my childhood, you know, like Lucille Ball and Bob Hope and Donald O'Connor and people like that. So that was an exciting place to work. And I just kind of couldn't believe I was actually there. And from there, one thing led to the next thing. And I really never had to rewrite my resume after I landed that job as a page.
For those who may not be familiar with it, what exactly is a page?
You're a glorified usher. And by glorified, I just mean rather than a movie, taking people in to see a movie or a play, you're taking people into the taping of a television show. So what's glorified is that you actually work on the set of a TV show. So studio audiences get to see shows for free, but in exchange for that, they sort of have to sit there and kind of put up with however long it takes to record this TV show. And the shows that back then that I did were those Norman Lear sitcoms and the John Davidson talk show. We also did Give Me a Break sitcom. There were things taping there like People's Court, like, you know, stuff came in and out, but I was only a page for a year. But yeah, you wear a polyester uniform with your name tag. You meet the people who are like tourists or busloads of people that come in to see a certain show. You get on the bus, give them like a pep talk about what all is going to go on, and you know what behavior that we would expect from them. You can't really get up and go to the bathroom in the middle of a scene, and people sign up, and in other words, they say, "Sure, I'm getting to do all this for free. I'm getting to see a taping of Different Strokes, to see, you know, Gary Coleman in person," and that was exciting for folks. And so you make sure that they all get seated. And then the other thing that pages did on the lot, and they probably still do, is that like if in an office there's someone that calls in sick, you sort of temp. And I was temping in the office of the show called PM Magazine, and that led to them offering me a full-time position. So you're using your job as a page to make the connections that will lead towards your next line of work. But they also, being a page and like, or an intern or anything like that, also allows you to look at professionals doing their jobs and determine what would be a good path for yourself, what would be a good fit. Like, oh, I'd like to be a cameraman, or I'd like to be a writer, or I see that this person is called a segment producer. Let me learn more about what this person does. And, you know, once again, you can ask people when they're not too busy. You can say, tell me a little bit more about what you do. And it's a great place to learn and then figure out where you might like to go. Take your job as a page, as a springboard, and see where it could lead you.
Well, and a lot of other podcasts and on here included talk about getting your foot in the door, but it's also putting yourself in a position to get your foot in the door. And you mentioning, you know, being a page for a year and being able to eventually make these connections and meet these people. It's just such a great example of putting yourself in that particular position in order to get what you want, because you ultimately have to put forth that little bit of effort. Because I try and tell people, you know, it's not going to just happen. You have to put yourself in that position.
Yeah, you have to be the hardest working person there. Even if what you're doing is getting people coffee, you know, you have to make yourself indispensable. You have to be that person that people look around and go, where's Jimmy? You know, because Jimmy's always the guy that, you know, figures out what to do before it needs to get done. If you get a job, if you get an entry level position in any field, don't just sit back and wait for someone else to finish something. Be the person who finishes something. Those are the people that get promoted.
No, you're exactly right. So from there, you've produced and, you know, worked on a few different documentaries that I had the pleasure of watching. And the first one I wanted to talk to you about was family band, The Cowsills Story. So, what was kind of the concept of this being created?
Well, I spent my career in radio. So I had no background in filmmaking other than I was always that kid with the Super 8 projector and uh, the Polaroid land camera, and like I wanted as much photographic equipment as I could get my hands on as a kid, and I liked the idea of making little films and like projecting them on the back of my closet wall because you could that could be dark in the daytime and inviting kids in to see. Uh, yeah, I always loved really filmmaking, but when I was a kid, the Cowsills were my favorite band. So they were a family band. They were the real life inspiration for the Partridge Family. So there really was a band where all the kids were in the group, and their mom was in the group, and their little sister was in the group, and they really are the real deal. They are real musicians. So they kind of shot across the landscape of my childhood between 1967 and 1971, and then they disappear and they're gone. And we're way pre-internet. So when people are gone, they're just gone. I mean, you're scouring magazines looking for any sign of what they might be up to, but they're just gone. And as a kid, you know, you grow up and you move on and you get new favorite bands and all that. But you don't forget the things that you loved when you were 10. Like they stay in your heart for a lifetime, right? So as soon as you could Google or Yahoo or whatever we were doing initially, I the first thing I probably typed in was the Cowsills. I mean, everyone has their first search, right? It'd be an interesting show to kind of explore. Like, what was the first thing you searched when someone showed you a search bar? What did you search? So I found that fans had sort of created a website for the Cowsills. This is early 2000s, and there was a guest book, and you could sign it. And I just said, "Thank you for helping me grow up." And a girl who lived in near me in California wrote to me and said, "Hey, it says here you live in Los Angeles. You should really come to this one pub and see Bob Cowsill. He plays at this pub." And I thought, I don't want to do that. It just felt sad. I didn't know what I would find. Uh, and yeah, let's do that. And I made it 3 weeks away, sort of like when you schedule a dentist appointment. So it's like, I don't have to do that right now. I'll do that in 3 weeks. And so those 3 weeks came, and I've interviewed, like, you have to know, like at Premier Radio, the company that I started, and working for Rick Dees, I've interviewed thousands of celebrities. So I should not be intimidated by somebody, but when it's your childhood favorite, that's a whole different beast. You become 10 and you're very nervous. So I go into this pub, I meet this girl Karen, who's awesome, and she kind of gives me the lay of the land, like, this is where Bob plays, and he plays here 2 or 3 times a week. And you see this little stage under a dartboard, and you're like, okay. And then Bob shows up and sits right next to me, and I was eating like a baked potato with chili in it, and I just put my fork down, like, I can't eat sitting next to Bob Cowsill like that. That's not Those two things are not going to be happening congruously, or simultaneously. It has to be one or the other. And he started talking to me, and then the next thing I knew, the whole pub sort of filled up with more Cowsills. And the weird, fateful coincidence was that the night that I picked 3 weeks away was the night that Bob's brother John was marrying one of the Bangles. And they had taken, like Cowsills always do, as I've come to learn, they had taken their after party or after wedding reception into the pub. And they're all up on the stage singing together under the dartboard. And you're in a pub, so here's you, and there's the stage, and this incredible sound validating, what I knew as a child. These people are really, really good. And like, why are they in a pub? Like, what happened? So this, it brings the question, demands the question, what happened? And some of these fans kind of knew in advance that John was going to get married and that everyone would be there. So there's more fans than usual when it's just Bob and his guitar at the pub. And they're telling me a little bit of this and a little bit of that about how the dad had been abusive. And, so I kind of knew going in that some dark stuff had happened, but of course I didn't know the extent of it. But I drove home at 1 in the morning thinking, I have to figure out how to make a movie. And I didn't know anything about making movies. And then 8 years later, I had made a movie. So that, that's how hard it is to make a movie by yourself.
Yeah, no, I trust me, I can understand that. But that's an incredible story. And did it almost like when you heard them playing, did it almost kind of like take you back to your childhood, like you felt like a kid again?
Yeah. I mean, there were a few things that happened, and you definitely felt like a kid again. It was like the posters on your wall had grown up and were moving and talking. You could hear their voices, you could see their mannerisms. And Paul, one of the Cowsills, Paul, was having a conversation with his son Brandon, or Brendan, yeah. And they were just really enjoying the hell out of each other. And I thought, this is going to be okay. If you've grown up and you have a great relationship with your adult child, then you're okay. Like I don't have to be too afraid to investigate, because these guys are okay. Everybody's fine. And that's success to me, is having strong relationships with your children. I don't have any children, but you could tell from looking at it that they just super enjoyed each other. And I went back to the pub with my family. I said, like, you guys, I found the Cowsills. And, like, it was my birthday like a month later. And I said, let's go to the pub and I'll introduce you to Bob, and, so my mom and my two sisters and my little nephew, uh, and that's when I started asking him, like, has anyone ever told your story? And he's like, no, 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 it's too complicated. It's too big a story. Every one of us has 100 stories. And I said, Bob, look around this pub. Every person here has 100 stories. It's just a matter of, what story are you going to tell? Deciding what story are you going to tell, what scenes are or aren't a piece of that story, and if they are a piece of that story, string them together. That's what storytelling is, whether it's a documentary or a feature. It's still storytelling, and there's going to be billions of aspects to your story that we don't put in a movie because they're what I call off story. But there's still a story that we could tell. So don't get overwhelmed by the enormity of your life. We could still tell a story that's meaningful to folks. And that took me a while. At that time, I got my cousin Abby involved because she was in the film business. She did features. It wound up being a documentary because we couldn't get anyone interested in features. And then we reached kind of like a tipping point where the Cowsills had been invited to sing the national anthem at Fenway Park. And being from Rhode Island, they were big. They weren't a performing act at the time. They were kind of scattered all over the country, but they were all. There was a guy that worked at Fenway Park who was like me, a fan as a child, and he wanted them. And I guess that year, what had happened was, and I think it was 2004, what had happened was that the players that year were wearing their hair long, and they were playing hair because this guy was a Cowsills fan. The guy Charles, who Charles Steinberg, yeah, he was a Cowsills fan, and all the players that year had long hair. So he was playing hair, and all the fans had gotten to know Hair, the Cowsills recording of Hair. And so it was his idea to see if he could find the Cowsills and have them come and sing the national anthem. So the Cowsills are going to Fenway. I can either pick up a camera and go with them, or this moment passes and I don't have it on film. And anyone who's a filmmaker or a photographer knows the urgency of, like, let me at least just capture it, because it's going to happen with or without me, and I got to capture it. So they said, all right, but no one had signed any paperwork. There wasn't anything official. I was paying my own way. I took Ian Broyles, my cinematographer. We went to Fenway. We did all this. It's in the film. You can see it. And that led to me capturing, I think maybe, they took me back to their hometown. They showed me the houses where they had grown up. So now we've got like about 15 hours of footage. It's a starting point. And then it was just a matter of, all right, let's keep going. Let's get interviews. And but I wanted someone to help me make the film who knew a lot more about filmmaking than I did, and I wasn't able to find that person, and I was finding the wrong people who told me they knew how to make a film but didn't know how to make a film. Um, and it was around the time when you could get this technology on your computer. So this is the time period. And I don't know if you remember the time period, but for me, this was an exciting time when if you had a song in your head, you could use GarageBand. If you had photos you wanted to develop, you could get Lightroom. If you didn't know someone with an edit bay, you could learn how to edit film. And we downloaded Final Cut and we got to work. So I got to a point where the movie was pretty much ready to go, but it wasn't going to be good enough if I was the editor. I had only just learned how to edit. And my friend Bill Filipiak called me up and he said, "Hey, I've got this project and you may want to be involved." And he said, I said, "I can't do anything until I finish this movie." And he's like, "Maybe I can help you." And then, so in the last 6 months, Bill Filipiak came in and did the edit, which is why the film is so beautiful.
Yeah, and like I said, I watched it on YouTube, and it was very, very good. I really
Bill
enjoyed it.
didn't
You guys
watch
did
it
a
on
great job.
YouTube because it's not supposed to be on YouTube.
Mm,
Did you watch it on Prime?
yeah, it was Prime.
Yeah, I
Yeah, because
haven't put it on.
it was on Showtime first, and then it
Yeah, it
was
was on
on Prime.
Showtime.
Yeah,
Now it's on Prime, and I have a YouTube channel where I've got loads of special features and stuff. But I'm not quite ready to put the film on YouTube. I could probably figure out how to put it behind a paywall, but I just haven't done that yet.
yeah, it was Prime that I watched it. There's so many of them that I get them confused sometimes.
Yeah,
So
sure.
yeah, but either way, I really enjoyed the documentary. I'm very fascinated by documentaries, especially about topics that I know nothing about. So
Yeah.
I thought it was great.
Oh, thank you very much. I mean, that's a homemade movie. I definitely had a lot of help, but there's absolutely no production company or big studio involved in it, and that was a heavy lift because there's a lot of jobs that I do not know how to do. Closed captioning, like when Showtime bought it, they give me this list of deliverables, like insurance and I'm like, doesn't anyone work there? Like, can't you guys help me with some of these stuff? I had a, you have to assure them that everything you have the rights to everything internationally in perpetuity. So I had to hire a rights person. We had to go song by song by song and clear everything, clear every single clip, TV clip that's in there, and that wound up being more expensive than making the film, getting the rights to things.
Yeah, rights can be very tricky,
Yeah.
very, very tricky. But there's another documentary I wanted to ask you about too. It's called Margaret Singer Seeking Light, and this was a really powerful story. So, how did you connect with Margaret, and what made you want to tell her story?
Well, about 15 years ago, Jenny Reinisch and I had made a little documentary in which we interviewed 30 Santa Barbara area Holocaust survivors, and that was the first film I ever made. And we wanted to capture their stories because there was an exhibit in Santa Barbara called uh, Beyond, or I can't think of the name of it at the moment. There's an exhibit at the Santa Barbara JCC that shows that, that it's like a three-dimensional exhibit where you open these doors and you see photographs and you read the stories of all these survivors. Beautiful photographs were taken and everything, and we wanted something on film for each of these individuals. So I said I'll do it because I mean I love talking to people, especially people who have a story that needs to be shared. That urgently needs to be shared, and no one would have that story more than Holocaust survivors. And so I got to meet all these really wonderful people, and one of them was Margaret Singer. So this is in like 2004, around the time I started making Family Band. I made this film, and we called it We Played Marbles. And remembering a stolen childhood, we played marbles. The first question I asked everybody was, what's your what's your earliest childhood memory? And then I would ask them, when did everything start to change? So, what I tell people is, like, if you're going to be interviewing a whole bunch of people and you want those to be able to cut together nicely, always pick like two or three questions that you ask everyone, because then you don't have to set it up again. You can cut from thought to thought to thought. They're all responding to the same concept. So, what was your earliest child memory, and when did things start to change? And um, one of the women was talking about her childhood, and her name is Helga, and she said, "Oh, I had a scooter. We played marbles," and so that just became the title, because there's nothing more childhood innocent than we played marbles, and then of course their entire societies were obliterated. So Margaret was a woman who really captivated me then. When I interviewed her in 2004, she's sort of a magical creature. She's a person who everything that she says could basically be embroidered into a pillow. She just was a charmed person. She had these gorgeous blue eyes. You couldn't look away from her. And when she spoke, she moved her hands poetically. And I just fell in love with Margaret. And then I told my husband, I said, I'd like to make a movie just about Margaret. And, the years passed. And, when one day, right before the pandemic, my husband came home and he said, I just saw Margaret. He said, if you're going to make a movie about Margaret, you need to do it right now. So, in other words, Margaret was using a walker, and every year she was a little closer to the walker, a little closer to the ground. My husband's like, all right, she's getting closer and closer to the ground. Like, let's go in there now and speak with her, because she was 97. And she said, no, I don't have anything. She always was so self-effacing. I don't have anything to share. Like, she came over, and Jenny and I, set up the cameras, and all we did was speak to her. And like, all this movie really is like, it's like the opposite of the Cowsills, which was so arduous. All this movie really was speaking to Margaret and then showing her work, because a lifetime of art beautifully illustrates her story. She painted her despair, and she painted her joy, and she painted everything in between, the way she sees life. And she speaks as gorgeously as she paints. So when you meld those two, it's the film is beautiful just because of Margaret. And it was such an honor to be able to make this film, and it made her so happy to see her art on a big screen. And we premiered the film at the Santa Barbara Jewish Film Festival. She sat there and enjoyed it with her whole community. She spoke, she did a Q&A, and then the next week, my husband and I were going to take her out for dinner, and instead we took her to the hospital, and she passed away 3 months later.
Wow.
So that was definitely divine intervention. You capture this woman's story for the world. She's only going to be here a few more months. And that was, my honor to do. And we were in a bunch of festivals, and then the pandemic hit, and I decided just put it up on YouTube. Just let people, this is just, it's a short, let people enjoy the film. So this film, Margaret Singer, Seeking Light, you'll find on YouTube.
Yeah, and there's a certain raw feel about it, and like in the way that it was shot, and the way she explained her story, and the way that her paintings and her work were intercut, that I think it worked the best the way that it was put together. Because they're not all documentaries have to be this like clean, professional looking piece of work. I think it worked perfectly the way that it was done. And it's crazy just you mentioning her passing away not too long after the premiere of it. It's almost eerie, the timing of certain things, especially in instances like that.
Right. And that's why I think we have to follow our instinct. If you feel like you should capture something, go ahead and capture it. Especially if everyone has like a film studio in their hand, in their pocket. And if you shoot in landscape, I mean, I know a lot of people for TikTok like to shoot this way, but if you shoot in landscape and if your mom is coming over, your grandmother, your granddad, or your great uncle are coming over, just say, hey, can I ask you a few questions? Put your phone in landscape, and if you have an iPhone, whatever number this is, and it has cinematic mode, try cinematic mode because it does this beautiful sharp focus with a soft background. Um, Put them in a nice chair, put it in cinematic mode, get close enough because in cinematic you can't zoom, and ask them 10 questions, and ask your son or your daughter to ask grandma 10 questions just so you have it. And I'm not saying you got to sit down, start editing and learn how to edit, but just have it. And then you can figure out if you don't want to learn how to edit, maybe if you have a friend who will pull it into iMovie or pull it into something and post it on YouTube. You don't have to make a polished looking movie, but older people just, they have such a wealth of stories, and we all now have the tools to capture those stories.
That's a great point. No, I would advise that as well. So, as we kind of start to wrap up here, I did want to ask you about your podcast, Media Path Podcast, that you host with Fritz Coleman. How did you two meet, and how did you guys have the idea to do a show together?
We met a while ago, like maybe 30 years ago. He's a stand-up comedian who is the weather was the weatherman in LA for 39 years. Our NBC weatherman. So weathermen tend to be a household name. People in your city have heard of your weatherman. They may not be able to tell you the name of the guy that reads the news, but they know the name of the weather guy because the weather guy has to have more of a personality. And Fritz is a comedian, weatherman, and he started doing one-man shows. So well, on one man show or one woman show is really like taking the artist stand up and bumping it up a few notches, where now the mandate is people have to cry and laugh. They have to laugh and cry. They have to feel something and go home and talk about, what they experienced. It's just more than the bar of laughter. It's now the bar of feeling everything, feeling all your feels, right? So the first one man play that he did was called It's Me Dad, and the conceit was that he was making a tape for his kids to play when they're grown about who he is and why he is the way he is. And then this gives him the opportunity to go into his childhood and explain his parents, and just while he's having this conversation with his sons, that they'll see in it after they pull it out of a time capsule. And I thought it was such a great piece of work that it was in a small little theater in North Hollywood that I, approached him afterwards and I said, we could turn this into a TV special where celebrities come on with their dads. And, he liked that idea, and we went and pitched it to his boss, and that never actually happened, but he liked the way I thought enough to ask me to produce his next play. So we've been working together ever since. And I've been podcasting since you could, because, just like filmmaking, as soon as you could make your own radio show, I wanted to make my own radio show. So in like 2004, around that time when all this stuff suddenly, came onto our home screens, the ability to be a creative at home. I started podcasting with my friend Laura Swisher, who was a fellow comedian. We both did stand up, and we called that Wheezy and the Swish. And then she moved out of town, and I started doing a podcast where I was giving advice to teenagers, and I had a panel of teenagers. We would read questions from kids, and the panel would discuss what this person should do, like sort of like a panel version of Dear Abby, but with kids. And that was called Journals. And I did that for a while. And then I wanted to do a podcast with grown-ups because it's really hard. Sometimes you're expecting a certain kid, and like their mom says they can't come. And you're like, all right, if he were in a play, would you say he can't go do his play? Like, this is a commitment, but you can't tell people how to parent their own kid. And so you couldn't depend on these kids, basically. So one day I'm like walking with my husband, and he's hearing me, complain about how I can't depend on these kids. He'd always say like, hey, who was on the podcast? Who's going to be on the podcast? And I'd be like, well, you need to ask me who was on the podcast after the podcast happens, because I can't depend on any of these kids at all. And he's like, well, if you could do the podcast of your dreams, what would that be? And I was like, wow, I didn't know I was allowed. I thought my job was giving advice to kids. I didn't know I was allowed to have fun. And I started kind of just talking about how it would be all of my, comedy friends and all of my radio friends, and we'd just be talking about the stuff that interests us. And he's like, well, why don't you do that? And so I kind of shut down journals, and I did a show. Fritz couldn't do a show with me because at that time he still worked at NBC and he was contractually not permitted to like have a podcast or do commercials. They kind of keep their talent sort of locked down to certain branding, and then that's it. And so I started doing it with some other comedian friends, and then during the pandemic, Fritz said, "Oh, I'm gonna retire, and I'd like to podcast with you." And I kind of pictured whether or not I could put him on the team that I had created, and I didn't see it as a fit. So I kind of thought, well, I could do back to back podcasts. I could keep this podcast, which is called Things I Found Online, which I was doing with my comedian friends. And then I could keep my crew and then afterwards do my podcast with Fritz. But then the pandemic happened, and I would have been doing it, all on my own via Zoom. And so I just had to kind of contact my other podcast partners and say, I'm going to be shutting this one down. And I really felt badly. Like I felt like I was cheating on them. But Fritz was always my first choice. I had always wanted to do a podcast with Fritz. So once he had retired, that was going to be the direction I wanted to go.
Well, what's so great about the show is that you don't just talk about movies. You guys have talked about comedy, music, songwriting. There's a great variety of topics, and I've been listening to a few episodes ever since we set this interview up, and I really enjoy it. You guys have great chemistry, and I think that's really that's what makes a great podcast. Is you can have great guests, but the hosts have to be interesting and engaging as well, and I think you two do a phenomenal job of that.
Thank you, as do you.
Well, I appreciate that. No, and I love shows like that too. And you guys recently celebrated your 100th episode, so congratulations for that. Because I'm sure you know this as well. There are so many people that try out podcasting, and once they get a month, maybe a month and a half in, they realize how much work it is. And you see a lot of shows online that have that number of episodes, and they haven't done a new one in over a year. So I think 100 episodes is a tremendous accomplishment.
Yeah, a podcast is a relationship. You may go on a few dates and then like, I don't know if I really like this person enough to keep going. Like, but a podcast, like any relationship, requires a lot of work. So you want to put it in. You want to put in a lot of work if you care enough about maintaining this. But the work is if you have a full-time job or kids or responsibilities, a podcast isn't just turning on your computer and talking into a microphone and hitting posts. Like, I think people think it might be just like Facebook or Twitter where you just kind of like create it and then hit post. And there's a lot more hoops that you have to jump through, especially when you listen to it back. You have to like what you're hearing, and the sound quality and the fluidity of thought means you have to be prepared. You have to do what you did to talk to me before your conversation with me. Is like you listen to my show and you're prepared for this conversation. So if I say a thing and that triggers a thought that you only know because you're prepared, it makes for a better show, makes for a better engagement, right? And so there's a lot of pre-production and there's a lot of post-production in podcasting, even if you just do the audio version. But you do video and I do video, and that requires exponentially, even more. So it's not for everyone, I would say. It is sort of like it's going to be your second job. So it's not just like you're on a softball team and you go and play that game and you come back home. Podcasting requires, more of you than that.
Yeah, you took the words right out of my mouth. It's one of those things that on paper, it sounds fun and it doesn't sound that difficult. But once like you said, if it's an interview-based show like this one and your show, you have to do the research so that you know what you're talking about. Then you have to make sure the sound quality is good. You have to make sure the video is good, that it's appealing for people to watch. Then you have to share it online. You have to think about what you're going to do for the next show. It can become a grind, but it's much like filmmaking. If it's something you truly love doing, it's not going to feel like work.
Absolutely. It's going to feel like you are giving yourself the opportunity to express yourself in a way that's fulfilling. We all have gifts and talents, and I know that people who are talented at drawing, when they're drawing and then after they've drawn something, they just feel so wonderful about that creation. And I think we should all challenge ourselves to do something that lights us up, even if first you have to go buy the pencils and you have to, oh, I haven't drawn since high school. Like, yeah, I promise you, if you make that effort, if you get the supplies and you block out a little time and you create a little space for you to draw that flower that you can see out your window that you've been thinking about drawing, if you do it, you're just going to feel like you're floating. It's such a beautiful feeling to have created. And sometimes we hit those blocks before we do it because we can't imagine how we're going to get there. Like, oh, I can't. I have to take my mom to the doctor, and I don't have anything to draw with. But just do a little every day. Like, day one, all right, go on Amazon and pick out some colored pencils and let them arrive and kind of inspire you. And just take little steps towards creation, because creating makes us feel great. And not everyone has the time for a podcast, but you do have the time to write maybe a little paragraph of a story, or to help your friend with her hair. Wherever you're talented, it just feels good to create something.
Absolutely. Finding that creative fulfillment.
Yeah, and it doesn't have to be your job. It can be it can be in conjunction with the rest of your life, but just something that you look at and it makes you happy that that it exists because of you.
Absolutely. So, two-part question. What is one piece of advice that you would give to an aspiring filmmaker and to an aspiring podcaster?
Preparation and relationships. Treat everybody with kindness, because everybody, it feels good to be kind. And also, everybody could potentially be working with you or helping you with what you're doing. You need guests for your podcast, so you have to network and outreach of friends and friends of friends and friends of friends of friends, and then and that leads to more guests, or and then preparation, because as we were speaking, if you're when you've done your work, the work itself can feel like it's really just flowing smoothly. When you haven't done your homework and you come into class that day, you're like, you're kind of panicky. The day that you walk into class with your homework, you're like, I got this. And so preparation really helps you enjoy what you're doing. So in filmmaking, whether you're making a documentary or whatever you're making, you got to have a great script. You've got to have a shot list. You've got to prepare, what you're going to do, so that you can communicate that with everyone around you very smoothly, so that you can inspire others. The better you know what you're going to be doing, the better you're going to be able to explain it to others, so that they can help you achieve it, and that they feel confident that you know what you're talking about. And preparation helps you do that. And there's so many different ways to prepare too. Like one day you could be preparing your shots, and then another day you could be reading a book by a filmmaker that's just inspiring you and giving you little nuggets of wisdom to bring to the table, or to your body of work. So I would say two answers: preparation and relationships.
I love that. I always like to ask all my guests this to wrap things up. What's your favorite movie of all time?
Well, I kind of have two, and one is uh, Ordinary People. And I like that film because I'm so fascinated by the human condition, and how we treat each other based on how our parents treated us, and how we present ourselves to the world versus what may really be going on. And it's interesting that I choose Ordinary People, because it is kind of similar in story to Family Band, in that this family in Ordinary People is presenting something very lovely to their country club world, but inside their family, everything is falling apart. They're not able to attend to what's going on inside the family. And the other film is like the kind of the polar opposite of Ordinary People, and it's This Is Spinal Tap.
Great
You know,
choice.
and everyone has to say, every female my age has to say When Harry Met Sally, or I think We're Taken Out and Shot or something. But like, yeah, if I could say a third one, it would be, so Rob Reiner definitely. But This Is Spinal Tap. I just could watch that on repeat and it would make me laugh every time. I just love it.
Agreed. Do you have any website or social media you'd like to plug so the listeners can follow you?
Yes, because my name is not is doesn't repeat itself anywhere else online. So it's Louise, Louise Palanker, Palanker. So I'm Louise Palanker across the board. I do have a YouTube channel, and our show is Media Path Podcast. So we have separate socials for Media Path Podcast, but Louise Palanker on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok, which I don't attend to the way that I should. But so the Chinese are just like, we're not sure what's up with her. We thought we'd have her by now. She seems indifferent. Yeah, I'm not the TikTok target audience. I just know I'm supposed to be there, so I'm there. But yeah, I'm even on LinkedIn.
Yeah, I haven't made it to TikTok yet. I'm sure eventually I will, but it's been the first social media platform that has made me feel old. Because I'm like, I guess I don't get the concept of it, but people love it.
Well, on our podcast this Tuesday, tomorrow, we're going to have two TikTokers that are kind of in their 50s, and they're both kind of like nailing it. One is sort of an expert on Los Angeles, and he each TikTok is about a minute about Los Angeles history. So he'll go to a location and tell you about the place you drive by all the time or you visited, and so he's blowing up on TikTok. And then the other is our friend John Maddox, who actually mixes our show every week, but he's blowing up on TikTok with a channel that's very specifically about sound editing. So you can have really specific content on TikTok, and if you know what you're doing or if you know what you're looking for, I mean, I guess it serves that purpose.
Well, you definitely hooked me. I'm going to have to check that out now.
Okay.
Awesome. Well, Elise, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me. This was a great conversation. I learned so much, and hopefully get to do this again sometime in the future.
Very happy to join you. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Well, let me play our outro music here. If you want to subscribe to the show, just head over to linktree.com/featureprezpod. You can find links to social media where you can subscribe to the podcast. And don't forget, we're live Monday nights on YouTube at 8 p.m. Central Standard Time. That's going to do it for this week's show. So enjoy the rest of your week, and we'll see you guys back here next week for another fun episode of Feature Presentation with Derek Diamond.